Hello, and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura, and I'm joined by Emma and Jasmin to talk about genes, mutations, and whether some mutations are beneficial or not. This episode kind of came about initially because I read an article that essentially said we're all mutants, and by middle age, each cell in your body will have accumulated around 1,000 genetic errors. Now, Emma, you're a biophysicist studying things related to this, so what can you tell us?
Yeah, so biophysicist, but also I guess my background is somewhat in biology explicitly with my fancy A-level in biology. So that's where you kind of learn a lot about DNA. So I feel like I've done a lot of like theory during that, but then actually now every day when I go in the lab, I use DNA and I kind of work with that as a part of my experimental techniques. So I think when you said that we're all mutants, I think it's a really nice tagline. So I was very excited to join on this episode.
I think I've got probably an A-level biology, so high school level, where you learn about how cells divide. I remember it being strangely complicated with lots of words, but it was a long time ago when I studied it. It's a weird one. And Jasmin, you're a chemical engineer, so I guess you probably don't know as much about this as Emma does. So what's your interest?
Chemical engineer, and also I stopped biology at GCSE level, so very long time ago. Yeah, I'm just interested in like the mutations and whether or not we could actually, like, humanity could end up like mutants like in the X-Men or other comic heroes. So I just want to know, like, can we be superhuman through mutations?
Nice. This is something I wonder about as well. I feel like it's probably quite far-fetched that we'd end up being able to fly, or, you know, if you get bitten by a spider, you'd end up with superpowers like Spider-Man.
Or laser eyes.
Or, yeah, all these weird physical feats that don't seem to quite make sense with biology.
Control the weather with your mind.
Yeah, and I kind of think that any change in human biology would probably happen quite slowly, so you wouldn't see this sudden people wake up and suddenly you're able to do something superhuman, because it's all about evolution, right? So you might evolve a superpower with time, but maybe not. So going back to the article I read about these genetic errors, amongst other things, it mentions cell division and how that can bring changes to genes in there. So this is essentially about cells copying themselves. And it said that 4 million cells divide every second, which sounds like a lot. But then I read that there are about 30 to 40 trillion cells in the human body. So only a tiny fraction, about 1 in a million, I think, is dividing at any one time, if that maths is correct.
It does make sense to me when you think about the numbers. And I guess this is where I can hopefully come in and say maybe what cell division actually is and what's happening. Because Laura, you are exactly right. There's so many like fancy words and it's like a cycle and they all end in phase. And essentially all that's happening in our cells when they divide is, first of all, the DNA gets replicated, then other things get replicated, and then the cell actually just doubles in size and then pulls apart. So all that's really happening is our DNA unzips itself, finds some more strands of DNA to form these two lovely new strands. And so another fact I can actually throw out is that in each of our cells, there is 2 meters of DNA. So if you think about how much DNA has to actually compact and fit in and how many different things need to be read at a time, I feel like it makes quite a bit of sense that when you're trying to actually copy each strand of DNA, you're going to get some errors and some things maybe that you don't want happening to just start arising.
Yeah, I mean, I remember around about the time I was doing my A-levels, decades ago, this was when there was a lot of talk about the Human Genome Project, which was to map the entire human genome, which they said would fill like phone books worth, like if you printed it out. I feel like a lot of people won't know what a phone book is now because they've gotten quite slim. This is a bad example. But 20 odd years ago, this was a big thing.
No, I remember hearing about it when I was doing some studies as well. And I still think I'm quite amazed that they actually managed to do it in the end. Because there just is so much information. And I don't even know how you even go about actually extracting all of that to figure out the different bases and everything like that.
Yeah, and I guess figuring out variations between populations as well. You can't just take one person's DNA and map it and say, right, job done. You'd have to take a decent sample of the population, right?
Yeah, for sure. And Actually, one thing I was going to mention, in our DNA, it's made up of these base pairs that maybe people know, so like A, T, C, and G. I mean, the phone book of the human genome would just be a series of those letters just repeating in random orders. How information is stored in DNA is actually really clever. So the 3 bases code for one amino acid, and so a whole chain of DNA would code for a protein that can then execute a function in the cell or something like that. But something to know about DNA is you actually have some DNA which codes for things and some which are kind of turned off. So even if you know your whole genome, it's actually really hard to predict what characteristics you're going to have, because you can express the gene for, I don't know, black and blonde hair. And then, I mean, I don't know if that's a good example because I'm not a biologist, but more like the Genome Project is so interesting because it tells you a lot without actually you being able to extract much about it.
I feel like we're probably just saying a whole load of biology buzzwords and Jasmin saying, what?
Yep. Many words that I do not understand.
No, I think essentially we're saying DNA is acids and they tell your body to make proteins, and sometimes they don't tell your body to do that. It's probably a really simple version of what Emma just said.
I think I understand that.
It's a bit like a recipe that basically says you're going to need these ingredients, these 5 ingredients, and then when you actually get to the recipe, it's like, we're only going to use 3 of those. So it's like you have everything, but it's not always used, if that makes sense.
It does in my cookery world, yes. I do this all the time. I don't have that ingredient. I'll just not do that thing. I'll use this thing instead. But I guess if we get back to this cell division thing, I'd read that it takes around about 24 hours for most types of cell in the human body to divide. And I had kind of wondered if I could get to the point where I could calculate, well, how long does it take for your entire body to renew, say? But apparently that's a silly question to ask because biology doesn't quite work like that. It doesn't have that. It doesn't work on that beat of a drum, say. So 24 hours for most types of cell to divide is the best I could get. And they only do it when it's necessary, which is something I didn't quite understand. What counts as necessary? I don't know if that's something you've encountered, Emma.
You know what? I actually don't think it is. Maybe it does make sense for them not to just constantly keep on dividing, but I feel like some cells, like the lifetime of a cell, like there's going to be a time where it doesn't work as efficiently and then it might divide and kind of regrow and renew. But I feel like that analogy of things, cells constantly dividing your body, is a bit like if you have a broom and you replace the head and you replace the stick, how many times is it the same broom? It's kind of like our body's constantly this dynamic state of new and old cells, which is really cool.
So you're never really the same person. You're always taking in new material to renew parts of yourself. Which I guess is kind of where Jasmin's question about could we all become superpowered mutants comes in, because that change is always happening, although you don't really see it.
I think sometimes you don't see it as a great point for me to maybe actually define to Jasmin and to the audience what a mutant and a mutation in your DNA actually means. And the way I learned it initially is you can have 3 different types of mutation. So in your sequence of DNA, you can have an extra amino acid thrown in, you can have one taken out, or you can actually have one swapped out for other things, which basically means that it doesn't have an effect. So we probably are having a lot of mutations that just don't seem to change any effect on our body, and we'll actually never know if that's even happening.
Which then makes the Human Genome Project even more impressive that they managed to map it all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I remember from when I was doing a lot of radiation chemistry, although I wasn't working on biology or DNA, I listened to a lot of presentations of other people that were, and they talked about how when radiation interacts with your body, it's not necessarily the radiation itself that causes damage to the DNA, it's the way it breaks down water or other molecules in your body to create reactive chemicals, often called radicals. And it's those radicals that then can break bonds in your DNA that lead to a sort of damage. And some of it's really short term, but then there are longer term processes that happen. It sounds like it gets really complicated really quickly, so I don't have any specific information.
Even hearing about that though, and I guess more of a chemistry and the radiation side of it, it's just things that I've never even thought of because I've just worked with it so biology, or I need this in the lab, so I'm just going to put some DNA in there, and I don't actually really think a lot of the times about different environments that DNA is thrown in and how it has to kind of manage.
How do all these external factors, how do they affect the mutation rates?
I would imagine that's a difficult thing to define because your body has all these really good repair mechanisms. So I want to say they're constantly looking for faults in the DNA and correcting them. They're obviously not looking for things. They're not sentient. It's all just biochemistry. So it's just a chemical doing what chemicals do. But it does make it difficult to predict. You can't really say, well, you've been exposed to this much radiation on this time frame, therefore these changes will happen, because it depends on your biochemistry and the genes that you already have, I think. Does that sound right to you, Emma?
Yeah, it really does. And I also think like environmental factors in general can really change the way that our DNA behaves and which things get expressed. You read a lot sometimes about the effects of stress, or if you're really tired. And there's some people kind of have said that these environmental pressures on your DNA change what kind of proteins are expressed or not expressed. So that could be why you maybe feel, I don't know, more sad if you're more tired, or I don't know what the link is. I don't think it's a direct one-to-one thing that's happening. But there's definitely a lot of evidence that different environmental pressures can change the way that you kind of adapt to the environment, I think. So yeah, it does kind of make sense in what I think I know in my DNA theory anyway.
I don't have any specific examples of this, but I do remember reading that if one gene is switched off or not being expressed, sometimes a different gene can turn on and do a similar job, or it can lead to a different route to having the same effect. I really wish I had a nice, neat example to explain that, because it sounds really hand-waving. But my point is, it still makes it difficult to determine if you're mutating to eventually have a particular effect. It's difficult to judge what that effect would be if we're going back to this idea of could we become superheroes, which is very disappointing, I think.
So, like, obviously most mutations, like, they're not noticeable, but in terms of, like, accumulation, like, how long would a mutation need to accumulate to just, like, have an effect or to be noticeable?
Good question. I guess just because one cell ends up with a mutation doesn't mean that all of your cells do. But then does that mean that all of your cells a certain number of your cells have to develop the same mutation? And how likely is that?
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's not a question we can answer, I don't think. I'm not sure anyone could. Ask a biochemist, maybe. Frustrating, right? Biochemistry is complicated. This is what I've learned so far. So if that's at least some of the detail about how mutations can occur, which is either because our own biology, when cells are dividing, is introduced an error, or it's because of external factors like radiation or other substances that can cause mutations. I feel like maybe we should zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture.
I think that's a great point about the bigger picture, because I feel like for me, I'm very much looking at the cells, or the images I've seen and the effects I've seen have been very much on the cellular basis, or even just like literally in the DNA. And so I kind of am really intrigued to what you guys might know about how we see those mutations in evolution. Because we all know dinosaurs were a thing at one point, but now we're humans, so I feel like I can't put together the pieces a little bit.
Yeah, so I did study some paleontology in my undergraduate degree. I've had a really random career.
Yep, you have.
And I remember something about the DNA molecular clock, which, again, my undergrad degree was around about the time that the Human Genome Project was in full swing, so this became quite relevant, so it stuck in my head. And this concept it was several decades old at the time when I was studying it, and it's based on the idea that the majority of mutations don't really have any effect on evolution, and you get, I guess, what's almost like genetic creep occurring, where the mutations gradually build up in a species.
Oh, so it's a very slow, minor progression, just from mutations.
Yes, so the studies seem to show that DNA evolves at a constant rate, and that rate depends on the species that you're looking at. Certain genes in birds evolved at an average rate of around 1% every million years, so yeah, really slow. In human terms anyway, not in geological terms, which is what paleontologists are interested in. As far as geologists and paleontologists are concerned, that's really fast.
It does make you think about, is it things like sharks or some kind of sea creatures who have been the same since almost the dawn of time? that their genetic mutation rate just must be quite low, because they've kind of been very similar, or they're just like, I don't know, first try their genes were perfect and they were like, oh, these mutations are not helping us, we're just going to stay as we are.
Yeah, or it might also just be that their environment that they were living in, there wasn't the need to like evolve, because like what's it called? There's a type of moth that evolved during the Industrial Revolution. So originally it's supposed to be white, but because of all the soot from all the factories that were burning coal, to blend in and camouflage, it had to like become darker. So I think it ended up being black, so that it could like just blend it in camouflage.
Yeah, I remember reading about that in school, that there were already some that were black, but they were in a minority, but then became an advantage to be dark coloured. So they became the more dominant form. And I guess maybe sharks, they filled an evolutionary niche quite quickly because they're apex predators, I think.
Apex predator for millions and millions of years.
Yeah.
Listen to our shark episode.
Yeah. So it could be just that they're undergoing genetic creep, if you like. But there's no external factor that means it's suddenly beneficial to have a change in some externally obvious thing, like having sharper teeth or more fins or something. Why you would want those things? That's just weird. There was an episode that we did with Ellie. It's a shame Ellie isn't here because I think her zoology background would be useful. But it was about the Precambrian explosion, which is when suddenly lots of life forms seem to appear. And again, I say suddenly, in geological time, which is still like thousands and millions of years. There was external changes that led to different species happening. So it seems like it's more external factors that lead to evolution rather than just random genetic quirks.
Sometimes humans, and we put on that environmental pressure. And I saw, like, I don't know if it's, I hope it's real, but like the pictures of fruits, like before humans got involved and then after, and like an avocado had like a massive pit and it went to be really tiny because we've like bred the vegetables and the fruits to be the way that we want them to be. So I guess we don't have anyone forcing a selection pressure on us, but we have forced it amongst loads of different fruits and veg.
Same with orange carrots. Carrots weren't originally orange.
I did not know that. Why did we want them to be orange? Is this just a totally weird side point?
So they were selectively bred by Dutch farmers who wanted to cultivate carrots that were just orange as tribute to the House of Orange, who were the ruling family at the time.
Oh, so for no good reason then, because they could.
Yeah, basically.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, I didn't actually know that about the carrots, and I guess that's what happens when a mutation is successful and how it actually carries through. Because I feel like we've talked about some mutations that don't actually have an effect, but a lot of the times when mutations do have an effect, the cell actually just kind of switches off and stops the rest of the cell division, so you can't carry on that mutation. And these are kind of called cell division checkpoints, where in this massive long cycle with the fancy names, different proteins are involved in basically checking things happened correctly, and if they don't happen correctly, the whole process stops. So I feel like we probably filter out a lot of the negative mutations with these checkpoints. And maybe carrots don't have much of a sophisticated mechanism as we do.
That kind of links back to what I was saying about cells having really good repair mechanisms. Like when a cell is functioning normally, it has proteins that look for damage. So even when it's not dividing, it's still got these proteins that are randomly making stuff happen. I don't want to use the word they're looking for things because they're not, they don't have eyes. But there are different types of damage that they can help the cell to repair. And some of them are just like a small change to one of the bases, like maybe a bond gets broken, a chemical bond, or a methyl group, so something that looks like methane gets attached to it, and that can simply be reversed. Or you get damage to entire sections of the DNA that can be replaced, and even if both strands of the DNA double helix get broken, they can be repaired in what sounds like a very complicated series of chemical processes involving lots of proteins and enzymes to merge the two strands back together, which I'm very reassured by as a radiation scientist, knowing that my DNA can repair itself.
How long does it take for DNA to repair itself?
Good question. I shall try to answer it based on what I've learned from my colleagues. Because I think some studies have reported that some repairs can take less than a second, sort of simpler ones, where it's just removing that methyl group or repairing a bond, I think is what they were saying. Others can take even longer, possibly even hours to repair. There's a suggestion that these more complex repairs can be slow because they involve making genes express that weren't previously being expressed, so the gene has to be sort of, I guess, woken up is one way of looking at it. So it can then code for a protein or some of the biomolecule that can come in to help with the repair. In some studies, I said these things don't have eyes, they're not looking for something. So some studies seem to suggest that the DNA just randomly bumps into these repair molecules. So things like the concentrations of these molecules would affect the repair times. So the short answer to that is some take seconds, some take us hours. The long answer is, well, it depends on a whole bunch of factors.
Nice.
Whenever I think of DNA, and even in this conversation, I do just think like it's so impressive as like a molecule and how our body kind of responds and does all of these things, and it knows exactly what to do, and nothing really goes wrong, and it's just like a really well-oiled machine. I just think, I don't know, it always makes me really interested in biology and DNA whenever I talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes things do go wrong. But as you say, given all the chemistry that's happening in your body at any one time, it sounds like more often than not, things go right.
Yeah, and I think they can repair mismatched things that happen, and just I think they just kind of go with the flow and just they're there to fix it when they can.
Which also kind of puts a bit of a dent in Jasmine's. Are we all going to become mutants at some point that have superpowers?
So we're not going to become mutants?
Not ones with superpowers, we are all mutating.
Okay, cool.
But having said that, when we were talking before about changes in the environment, I did wonder if something, like climate change and all these other scary sounding things are happening, could that then lead us to mutate in some way, or we would have mutations that would somehow be beneficial to these extreme environments?
Something I just thought of with like mutations being beneficial to the environment. There's a few people that have it, but also like llamas have a really strong oxygen binding affinity curve, which basically means at low oxygen concentrations, their body can absorb more oxygen, and essentially it behaves as if they're in a rich, oxygen-rich environment. And because like llamas can stay in like high altitudes, it's actually really beneficial. And actually a lot of people who live in areas which are like surrounding really big mountains, so a lot of the Nepalese people have really incredible like oxygen binding affinity curves when they've been measured by scientists, and they're just like living in this environment and not experiencing these altitude sicknesses or oxygen deficiencies because their body is just made for it, which I think is really impressive.
So does that mean if they go down to somewhere that's lower altitude, they're suddenly like almost like having superhuman powers, like marathon runners, they can run forever and not get tired?
That's a good point.
Because that's what altitude training's about, isn't it?
Yeah. They could just easily go down to a country which is way almost just above sea level, and they would feel oxygen rich.
So what we're saying, to answer Jasmine's question, is get yourself to an extreme environment
Yeah.
and wait for some sort of mutations in your DNA that are already there to become beneficial.
May take generations, though.
Yeah.
Maybe not if it's already there and it just needs to be switched on. I don't know. Who knows what's lurking in that DNA that's switched off? You hear things like it's helpful for a gene pool to be very diverse, don't you? That if there is a change in the environment, then although some individuals won't bear particularly well because of that change, others, because they've got the diversity, will kind of come to the fore. Pretty much what you were saying about those peppered moths. So I guess ultimately, any unhelpful mutation would mean that you wouldn't survive, but then other mutations could give you an advantage, especially if there is a sudden change in your environment. I'm thinking of things from the animal world, like giraffes that have long necks, they can reach food other animals can't. They developed that to fill a particular niche. I would assume there are some more subtle changes if you looked at the biochemistry.
Yeah, and I think a great point of coming back to maybe we're all mutants, and I wonder if anyone actually has this or has friends who have this, because I definitely have friends who have it, but it's the coriander soap gene.
That's me.
It's a mutation in a gene that basically means you have a chemical sensitivity to one of the chemicals in coriander. So there is science backing up to why people can feel that coriander tastes like soap. If you do have that gene, then you are definitely a mutant, but I would also argue that we're all mutants because we're all different.
We're all mutated in a different way. I have no idea what that thing is, by the way. To me, coriander is just coriander. It doesn't taste like soap. I obviously don't have that gene.
It tastes like soap. Doesn't taste good.
Then again, for quite a long time, I hated the taste of celery to the point that I would actually spit it out of my mouth. I'm not too sure if there is a gene that says celery tastes revolting, but I don't mind it so much now. Your tastes change as you grow. Whether that gene is turned off or not, I don't know if that's related or if it's something else.
What causes genes to be like turned on or off? And like, why do they do this?
It's hard to tell, but I think I would say you can have a majority of it just being kind of external factors, and like the environment can really, especially when you're like growing up, and I think you're like you have a faster rate of cell division. I think the environmental factors can really just affect so many different things. And also there are like other proteins in your DNA that actually cause them to turn off and turn on. So I feel like there's just so many factors that it's so hard to pin down what is actually causing specific things to turn on or turn off.
Some of it is to do with receptors on the surface of cells, isn't it? I know that some cells have like epithelial growth factor receptors on them. So this is a hormone, the growth factor, I think. And that hormone binds to the receptor on the cell, and the cell's right, all right, I'm going to start growing then. I read a study about something called the gene Notch in esophageal cancer, and it doesn't seem to affect whether you will or will not get cancer, but it does help the cancer to grow. So something else makes you get esophageal cancer, some carcinogen or something maybe, or some other mutation that's happened randomly for whatever reason. And because it's already got this Notch gene, it then can help it proliferate. It's interesting to me how much genetic research goes into understanding how to understand what happens in cancer.
The stats according to Cancer UK are 1 in every 2 people will get cancer at some stage in their life, so not good odds.
I wonder if they are all caused by mutation, or if sometimes something in the cell just happened, it was already there. And it's just been switched off until that point.
There are like genes that do make you more susceptible to certain types of cancers, because there was the one that was identified for breast cancer.
The BRCA1 and 2 mutations.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's basically where these genes code for a molecule that will seek out cells before they become cancerous. But in some people it's mutated, so that gene doesn't function as well. Somewhat reassuringly though, just because you have that mutation doesn't mean you definitely will get cancer, because there are more factors involved.
No, same like there's also a gene that makes you more susceptible to developing Alzheimer's, but it doesn't guarantee you'll actually will develop Alzheimer's.
Biology is complicated.
Yep.
I think, having dwelled a little bit on mutations that aren't necessarily all that helpful, there must be some that are probably quite beneficial, ones that you would want.
Like superhuman strength.
You may want that. I can't say I'm that interested in superhuman strength.
You can move a lot of heavy stuff.
You can make machines do that, though.
No, but you can be at the airport and not be like struggling to carry your massive check-in bag.
Also not a situation I've been in, but I can understand how that would be frustrating. I don't carry a lot of stuff when I travel.
Really useful when you're moving furniture.
Also not struggled with that. Maybe I'm already superhuman strong.
Maybe you are.
So apart from superpowers, there is maybe a few genes that we might want. There's a gene that's, I don't even know how they identify the genes, but like it's actually crazy. There's a gene that's called SLC30A8, and apparently people that have that gene are 65% less likely to get diabetes. And in what way and how you're less likely, I'm not actually sure. But it's a positive for the fact that you may have some genes that are very beneficial to you that you might not know of.
So that means you could eat as much sugar as you wanted and have a really unhealthy lifestyle and not get that particular disease.
Yeah, for sure.
Another one that I would want, and this is only because I am lactose intolerant, but apparently there's a mutation that means that you are not lactose intolerant, so you can eat as much dairy as you want and not have your guts feel like they're about to explode. So that would be nice.
When you were talking about superpowers before, I said I didn't want superhuman strength. But when I thought about it, as you guys have been talking, I would quite like the ability to be kind of like Ant-Man. I know Ant-Man didn't have a mutation. It was a suit and the Pym particle that made him go really small. But imagine if like you could just make part of your body turn into like a mini you and then send it somewhere. Wouldn't that be really useful if you knew what it was doing and you could see small things happening somewhere else? Like you've lost your car keys and you need to go and look for them. You can send 10 mini yous off to go and search.
So your superpower would be the ability to clone yourself as well as to change the size of your body.
Yeah, to make a tiny clone, yeah. Which I assume is biologically impossible because you couldn't replicate everything a human body does on that small size. It has all those cells for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the Ant-Man logic was just that the space between the atoms was smaller.
It was, which I also think is physically impossible.
Yeah.
Atoms are that size for a reason. Molecules are that size for a reason. What about you, Emma? What superpower would you want?
I have been thinking about it when you were saying that, and I've always wanted to be able to fly, but I wouldn't want the flying to feel like running, which I feel like it would do. Like, I feel like it would be a workout. Yeah, that's always been my number one choice if I could choose, I think.
I always feel like flying is going to be really uncomfortable just because you'd have all the wind, like, whipping past you, and then your eyes would get really dry and other stuff.
You would like to think if you've mutated to be able to fly, so if you just had wings, you would also mutate in a way that would make your body resistant to whatever's going on when you're flying.
Yeah, or I just wear some goggles,
Some aviation goggles.
I'll be fine.
And a helmet,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of flying as well. I still like the idea of being really tiny. I feel like that has more uses. I like the idea of talking to my rats as well and playing with them a bit more than being a giant human. If I can be rat-sized and then go scare people. And I am just rambling now, so I'm going to leave it there. I think we're saying that it's highly unlikely, given how biology and genetic drift or gene mutations work, that we would develop superpowers. And there are probably some slightly more sensible superpowers beyond being tiny and being able to fly that may happen in the future as a result of environmental changes. But then again, humans are quite good at insulating themselves from environmental changes in some way, so maybe not. Sadly, I think I'm saying, Jasmin, we're not going to become superpowered mutants.
Boo!
But maybe if someone wanted to genetically engineer something, which is a very different episode, I think, maybe then.
That would be basically Deadpool. He's a mutant.
Yeah.
Oh, Wolverine, he was also genetically altered.
Did he not already have a mutation? I know he was altered. His skeleton was more.
Yeah, his mutation is regeneration, but the actual, core thing was genetically modified in him. He can't be Wolverine without the actual genetically modified bit. He'd just be guy who regenerates.
Was it the claws that were the genetically modified bit?
Yep.
Which they then... Yeah, right. Because the adamantium was chemically attached to him by engineers.
Yep.
If anyone has no clue what we're talking about, go watch some X-Men.
Or go watch the latest Deadpool movie.
Right, so I guess we'll leave it there. We'll see you all next time for another, probably just as weird and strange, science-based conversation. The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.